Hello and welcome to Counterpunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. First time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. Always happy to have you. Go over to Counterpunch, get your subscription to Counterpunch Plus, and do it now. That's how you support Counterpunch. You know you love it. You know you've loved Counterpunch for years, and you know you've always wanted to support your favorite independent media outlets. You just haven't had that push. Well, I am pushing you. Go do it. I'm being pushy about it. Go do it. But also, in all seriousness, I think Counterpunch is one of the real last spaces that we have on the left where you get many different perspectives, all of which of various flavors of the left, and allows a platform for debate, for discussion, for critical analysis, all of these things. So Counterpunch, I think, is unique in that regard. Go over to the website, counterpunch.org, get a subscription, buy a copy of the Counterpunch Plus Journal. That is the best, the collected writings from 2021, the best that Counterpunch had in the subscriber section. It'll give you a little taste and you can see for yourself just how great the content is. So, speaking of great content and great contributions that Counterpunch gets regularly, I have one of those people with me today. It's Jeff Sommers. Jeffrey's written a really important piece a couple of weeks ago. You know, it's interesting because we had scheduled a conversation to talk about the death of a very important global figure, and now that's overshadowed by the death of the Queen, who I would say is marginally important and yet extremely important to discuss and deride. But anyway, we're going to talk about Gorbachev. Here's Jeff Sommers. Jeff is he's a political economist. He's a contributor to Counterpunch. His most recent book, The Contradictions of Austerity, The Socioeconomic Costs of the Neoliberal Baltic Model. He is at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and he is a friend of Counterpunch. Hi, Jeff.
Eric, great to be here. And while in Wisconsin, we're known to be Wisconsin Midwestern nice. I as well will actually be a little pushy and counsel your viewers to subscribe to Counterpunch. What a wonderful resource.
Agreed. It's been central in my own political development now for for 20 years, actually. So yes, Counterpunch means a lot to me. It means a lot to a lot of us. So anyway, all right, Jeff, you're here to talk about Gorbachev and the death of Gorbachev. You had a great piece in Counterpunch earlier this month. Actually, it was technically the last day of August, August 31st, but let's just call it the beginning of September. How Mikhail Gorbachev became the most reviled man in Russia. So there's a lot to unpack in that title, but let's just ask the most broad question. How did he become the most reviled man in Russia, Jeff?
Well, of course, for the reasons that I think most of us all know, which is the absolute collapse that we saw in Russia in the 1990s following his rule. We are familiar with the social and the economic indicators from that period. Just an absolute travesty. I spent a good bit of time on the ground in the former Soviet Republic of Latvia in the 1990s, and it was just an unmitigated disaster. In fact, when I visited on a trip in 1995, I had my new spouse in tow, who was a Latvian American, and we went to visit one of her elderly aunts, and we actually found her under a bridge selling her belongings, along with dozens of other pensioners. This was not an uncommon sight throughout the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. Just absolutely terrible. But of course, the unraveling began long before the Soviet Union had died. The 1980s, of course, represented a protracted period of crisis, which absolutely had to be addressed. And it's not as if Gorbachev had a non-problem to deal with.
Absolutely. And, you know, I lived in Russia briefly in 1993 and 1994 when I was still 10 years old and my father was working there at the time. And I have vivid memories of what Moscow was like in 1993, 1994, which was the beginning of the real inundation of the gangsters, the mafia groups, the various violent criminal elements that began to ultimately wage war on the streets of Russia and the former Soviet republics all throughout that period. And I remember, just as you say, I remember walking through the park with my mom holding my hand and seeing a man selling his personal library. And I mean, this wasn't, these weren't like pulp books or something. I mean, these were like scientific textbooks, engineering books, books on history, social sciences. I mean, I remember thinking, I was like, wow, why is this guy selling all of his, all of these belongings? And only obviously in retrospect, understanding that he had been pushed to the most, to the brink of desperation for somebody who was, highly educated engineer and, et cetera. He had been pushed to sell his books, and that was what he had to feed his family.
Yeah, it wasn't just the working class, which was tragic enough that they were destroyed by the unwinding of the Soviet Union. But as you say as well, it was the middle class, and then again, all of these pensioners, many of whom had to sell off their apartments on the cheap, and just whatever equity they had built up, it was all liquidated, and it was all fairly by the 1990s consciously done. I mean, they knew that they wanted to start from afresh, and so they destroyed the currency, which meant destroying everyone's savings. So it was a wreck. It was a wreck.
Now
But
talk to me a little. I'm sorry. Go ahead,
no,
Joe.
you go ahead, please.
No, talk to me a little bit about Gorbachev. Especially our younger viewers and listeners may not have all of the background on who he was. Not maybe they know that he was a leader of the Soviet Union, but who is this guy? Where does he come from? What shapes his thinking and his thought? And then especially if you could explain how he really was different from the other leaders who had come before him.
Yeah, as I detail in my article, I describe him as a democratic socialist in terms of his inclinations. So we have this vast literature that is anchored in the thinking of people like conservatives such as Friedrich von Hayek, who wrote his famous book on the road to serfdom, which essentially argued that if you pursued socialism, it would ultimately take you to the end point, destination of serfdom or slavery, and that the model itself predetermined this outcome. With Mikhail Gorbachev, we see that that argument doesn't hold. So we have a figure who is from the provinces, kind of like Lenin, I guess, in that sense. He was a provincial intellectual of sorts, although Lenin had more of a privileged background, whereas Gorbachev had a background which is anchored really in the rural, peasantry to some extent. He grew up about 120 kilometers or so just southeast of what is modern day Ukraine, and he, in large part, was even raised by his maternal grandparents, who were ethnic Ukrainian. And he, through some combination of merit and good luck, is able to climb the ladder of social mobility at a time when the Soviet Union was experiencing some significant degree of economic growth in the 1950s. Is able to attend Moscow State University, which is the country's premier institution of higher learning, and through diligence, hard work, a reputation for actually getting things done, eventually scales that ladder all the way to the top post in the entire Soviet Union, that being the general secretary of the Soviet Union. Now, that said, he is also really the first and the last of a generation of leaders in the Soviet Union that had no connection to Joseph Stalin, either personally or through the cadre of successors that he created. So he was really detached from that, and he was very much influenced by the writings of Vladimir Lenin. And as I argue in my article, I mean, of course, there are at least two dimensions to Vladimir Ilyich. We have a figure who is both very focused on concepts of democracy, worker empowerment, etc., but also a figure who could be ruthlessly brutal in terms of realizing this revolution that he wanted to bring about. And the side of Lenin's personality that Gorbachev latches onto is that one which is committed to democracy. And Gorbachev thinks that the way to cure the ills, the dysfunctionality of the Soviet economy by the 1980s is to simply democratize it. And he always turns to the writings of Lenin when he encounters a problem and thinks that he can find the solutions in that 43-volume set of Lenin's writings that all leading figures in the Soviet bureaucracy would have had. Most of them would never have opened one of them, but nonetheless, they all had them. But in Gorbachev, we actually had a guy who read them. And that is the tragedy, as I say, the really Greek tragedy proportions of a figure like Gorbachev, inclined towards democracy, but unleashes all of the worst tendencies that were already existing within the Soviet Union or latent and just looking to be uncapped and let loose.
To that point about Gorbachev's thinking and philosophical outlook, etc., I'm reminded of the late Stephen Cohen, who famously, I mean, he traveled to the Soviet Union many times, of course, and, he personally knew Gorbachev, etc., but
And lived
specifically,
there quite frequently as well. He had an
yeah,
apartment in
yeah.
Moscow.
Exactly. And I'm reminded of Stephen Cohen's book on Bukharin when
Oh,
that
yes.
came out and the impact that it had. And I heard a story, whether it's true or somewhat apocryphal, I don't know. Supposedly it's true that Cohen's book was extremely influential on Gorbachev in the 70s when it came out, and that Gorbachev had seen in Cohen's book and in the excavation of Bukharin's thought, which had been suppressed for decades, that he had sort of found some kind of a formula that might bring some kind of the positive changes that he I guess envisioned were necessary for the Soviet Union. So can you speak a little bit on his thinking and theoretical ideas and maybe where that comes from and ultimately how it went wrong?
Right. So, a great point. And you're absolutely correct that Gorbachev was purportedly influenced by Cohen's work on Bukharin. Bukharin, in the 1920s, was considered to be on the right within the Bolshevik party, and a not so much an architect of, but rather an advocate of the new economic policy, which was a structure for the economy that would bring the wrecked Soviet economy back from the destruction wrought in the Civil War from 1918 to 1921 by using some degree of market mechanisms and trying to unleash some of the dynamic entrepreneurial potential of the Russian people. Now, this doesn't mean a kind of neoliberal privatizing effort, but it did want to turn away from an overly bureaucratized and arguably necessary during the context of a civil war communist, fully planned economy, to one which relaxed some controls. And so we saw in the 1980s that Gorbachev begins to draw upon that equity of ideas that was resident in figures like Bukharin and Preobrazhensky and others from the 1920s, who thought that that was the direction to take the economy. Now, this wasn't just, of course, Gorbachev that was thinking in these terms. It was also Gorbachev's mentor of sorts. And of course, I'm referring to Andropov, who was the former KGB leader and then later general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party himself, who succeeds uh, Leonid Brezhnev, and recognizes that Brezhnev had in the 1960s and 1970s just left all sorts of areas of the Soviet economy neglected. That there were problems in terms of transportation, rail networks that, while vast, were in sore need of repair. Really, really bad roads. So just a very basic understanding of a need to repair the country's infrastructure. and to just shake up the bureaucracy a bit. Now, uh, going back to, well, why did we have this period of some stagnation or lack of dynamism? Yet one which is remembered quite fondly by many of the elderly in the former Soviet Union, that being the Brezhnev period. Well, one of the things that happened during Brezhnev's rule was that, one, Brezhnev recognized that you really wanted to just kind of take care of the bureaucracy, that would make them happy, and therefore that would keep your power intact. So, that meant that there were not going to be as many positive pressures that are needed to affect change, but also the discovery of the vast oil and gas fields in western Siberia. And that provided a huge store of wealth that the Soviet Union could draw upon to cover its trade imbalances and also to build up its military and provide some degree of consumer goods while failing to focus on innovation in their own country. And then, lastly, it should be remembered that the experience of World War II, it is just so deeply ingrained and burnt into the psyche of the Russians. So they really reconstructed their entire economy, both in the 1930s, anticipating World War II to some extent, but certainly following World War II to survive World War III. The assumption within the Soviet Union was that there was World War I, there was World War II, and that the Germans would be back likely in another generation. So you build an economy to survive World War III. Well, how do you do that? One of the chief assets you have is a dozen time zones. So you spread things out over this vast expanse of territory that the Soviet Union comprised, so that if you were ever attacked, enough of your industry would survive, and you would be able to take the initial hit and then eventually counterattack. Well, that model, while arguably good if you're preparing for World War III, was a bit of a disaster if you were trying to construct an efficient economy. In other words, you were building in inefficiencies on the score of transportation in order to have some greater degree of survivability. Well, Gorbachev inherits all of this, and Drop-Off, as we know, was ill and old when he assumed power, and so he didn't have enough time to implement the reforms that he wanted to put in place. And of course, he was followed by this Chernenko fellow who was even more ill and more elderly and did not last very long. And then, of course, we see this need to put forward a new kind of leader. The Politburo decides to put this guy that's 2 years younger than I am now in charge of everything, who is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he begins to attack these problems in the way that he best thinks is the route to go.
So let's talk about what Gorbachev actually did in terms of policy, and the way that I want to frame this, because we have limited time. So the way that I want to frame this is, if you could explain for our listeners and viewers, if you could explain what was Glasnost, how successful was it, what was the impetus for it, and contrast that with what was Perestroika, what was the impetus for that, and how did that play out, and maybe the interplay between the two. And let me just explain very quickly before I let you talk on that why I'm asking this question, because there is serious debate even among leftists and Marxists who are critical of Gorbachev. There is serious debate on the question of Glasnost versus Perestroika, and many who would argue, and I would as well, that Glasnost was extremely positive and Perestroika extremely negative. And so let's talk through what these two things were, how they interacted with each other, and ultimately what conclusions we should draw from those results.
Okay, so just on the most rudimentary level, I mean, Glasnost was an opening of society, right? So introducing democracy and removing this sense of fear and the idea that conformity was the only way to get by, was to keep your head down, keep your nose down, and not get into any trouble with the authorities. Well, from Gorbachev's perspective, this was an well, let's use Reagan-esque terms. So this was an evil in and of itself. But more than that, one could not have socialism. One could not have socialism in the context of a society that did not have openness. And so we see that Gorbachev invites this openness. And as you know, there was this great flourishing of ideas and of conversations regarding how the country should be managed. And one could make a case. I would even make the case that the Soviet Union in, say, the year 1990, was the most democratic country in the world. Very, very briefly. Given the range of debates that were taking place. Now, coexisted, of course, with a still really existing oppressive state apparatus, but one which was being, marginalized, a security apparatus. But in terms of liveliness of discussion regarding social, political, economic, cultural matters, it was unparalleled. Just to reference the experience of a mutual friend of ours, Boris Kogorlitsky, who you did a fine interview with a week ago. Boris was elected to the city council of Moscow in 1990. This is no small thing. Moscow is a country in and of itself. It's huge, both in terms of its population and the resources that it commands. Boris ran that election campaign, which he won, for $100. That was how much he spent on that campaign. Today, if you wanted to get a seat on the City Duma in Moscow, you either have to be in the favor of someone extremely powerful, or you might need to spend a few $1,000,000 in order to get that seat, because it's a sinecure that you could use for extracting resources and wealth
And just
out of the country.
to give that contrast, Boris ran for Moscow's city council again a year and a half ago and was arrested for his
Yeah,
efforts. So to
yeah,
give the illustration of the last 32 years, Boris ran in 1990 unobstructed. Boris ran in 2021 and was arrested.
right. And and it wasn't the first time, of course. And I will get to your point, of course, about Perestroika shortly. But in 1993, of course, when there was this reaction against the privatizations that were occurring, and the shock therapy that was being applied to Russia under the rule of Boris Yeltsin. Boris was at the Russian White House, at the Russian Parliament. He was part of that group of elected officials that were looking to slow these kinds of changes down and just re-examine the entire model of privatizations and shock therapy generally. And there's one great example that Boris used at the time in the early 1990s to illustrate how the privatizations that were occurring were just nothing short of theft. There was a hotel in Moscow that was being privatized, and I can't remember what the price was that they were selling it to this individual for. But to illustrate the point of just how much of a ripoff it was, Boris and his colleagues had just one item in that hotel appraised, and that was its chandelier. And politically, it was very smart. It was a great way to illustrate, the degree to which this ripoff was. What he pointed to was that the price that the chandelier alone in this hotel was valued at was more than the selling price of the entire hotel. So this is a nice illustration of this kind of wide
And
scale
and
ripoff
just
that
to
was
be
occurring
clear,
at
I
the time.
believe that was the Oktyabrskaya Hotel, which was the hotel that all dignitaries, visiting dignitaries, Soviet higher ups, etc., would always stay at. So it's not only value in terms of dollars or rubles, it's also had this extraordinary value of prestige that was just being sold off and stripped for parts, and in a sense, a microcosm of the entire country, really.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember, in the middle of the night, for instance, in places like Riga in the 1990s, I mean, you could see a bunch of lights in cemeteries. What are these? It's moving lights. Well, they're flashlights. And what are people doing? Well, they're stripping off the bronze plaques from headstones. They're just this anything that could be taken of value was being stripped off. And so what was called the colored metals trade in the 1990s was huge. So they were just stripping all of the copper, the brass, the bronze, the aluminum, whatever they could out. But now, regarding and back to the point of Perestroika. So, of course, that is an opening of the economy and of the power structure somewhat. So, what Gorbachev does here is one, again, assumes with Glasnost that you have this opening of society. This creates a more dynamic, open culture. Combine that with introducing what he had hoped would be on this other side of the ledger an equal dynamism in the economy by liberating company directors to produce goods and services off of the Goss plan directed a plan for that enterprise for the entire economy, and that this would lead to fewer supply shortages, newer products and services that people wanted, etc. Let me just give you one kind of simple example of how this worked when it actually worked as intended, which was not very often. So in Latvia, for instance, and this was how it was supposed to work. So you had a kolkhoz, a collective farm, and some of these were, huge enterprises, these collective farms. And so Gorbachev has his directive on enterprises, which says, okay, guys, if you want to produce something else, if you've met your target plans and you want to produce something else, go ahead, you do that, keep the profits. So one of the things that this one kolkhoz in a little place called Adaji in Latvia starts to produce are potato chips. Not just big truckloads of potatoes, but they actually begin to process them into a higher value added product, potato chips. And they make a ton of money. And the next thing you know, they're all driving around in new Toyota SUVs. and to this day, this potato chip company is the biggest one in Latvia. There's another kolkhoz that starts making beer. I mean, so that's how it's supposed to work. Now, how it also worked in the most dysfunctional ways was it opened the economy to widespread, wide scale theft. So if you were a more corrupt minded director of an enterprise, well, what could you do? Well, you could start, say, an import export business on paper. And okay, well, maybe that can be a good thing. And so you then started to work with the KGB. Why is that? Well, you were going to need some help in terms of navigating things like international banking systems, so that you could figure out how to trade your goods, get payments for them, all of the rest. Well, the only people who knew how to do that in the Soviet Union were the Czechists, because the Communist Party of the Soviet Union used to fund things like revolutions and all the rest around the world, and they needed to know how to shift money around and get it into the pockets of people they wanted to get it to. So uh, the KGB begins facilitating the creation of these networks, allowing some of these import export enterprises to come into being. And what many directors of enterprises quickly learn is that they can use this to say, let's say their enterprise has allocated a certain amount of oil for whatever it is that they're producing. Well, they can take that oil and they're getting it for next to nothing. They can sell it on global markets at the global world price and just capture that entire arbitrage between the state price and the world price, pocket that cash, deposit it in an account in London, and no one will know about it. Now, the other thing they can do is they can start creating their own commercial banks, uh, and the commercial banks can actually create their own money. It's not a nice thing to be able to do. And then the state bank would have to would have to cover any losses. They would have to cover this money creation of these commercial enterprises that were being created. Now, of course, this creates a class of call them oligarchs if you like, but people who are involved in the shadow economy. Let me give you, if I can test your patience here, one example of this in Latvia. So Latvia, because of its location on the Baltic Sea, it's facing westward. It is just a, a 10, 12-hour ferry ride from Stockholm, even less so to Helsinki, and, by plane, less than an hour. It is one of the chief transshipment points for Soviet raw materials to points west. So the Soviet export trade in oil, for instance, even the legitimate one, the chief port for that is in a place called Ventspils, which is another Baltic Latvian port. Now, with all of these new enterprises that are emerging as a consequence of Gorbachev's reform all over the dozen time zones of the Soviet Union, you create also an opportunity to make offshore banks in the Soviet Union itself and the post-Soviet republics themselves. It's no mistake that in 1990, the first legal in the Soviet Union currency exchange gets established in Riga by a couple of enterprising Komsomol members. These are young members of the Communist Party. They're all well connected because they have this national network. And there are these two guys, Kargan and Krasovitz, and they begin shuttling rubles, Soviet rubles, between Riga and St. Petersburg and Moscow by train. And then there are small little differences in the value of that currency between these three locations on the black market. And they're doing this by duffel bag and train. But by 1990, they create a legal currency exchange. And then money from all of the entire Soviet Union starts coming to them as these enterprise directors and cooperative directors start converting their Soviet rubles into hard Western currencies, British sterling and U.S. dollars. It's an incredible transformation that is underway, and they end up creating the largest in the 1990s and up until the 2008 crisis bank in Latvia. It was called Parex, and they both used to advertise right on their sign in the early 1990s. We take all currencies, we ask no questions. And another sign that they had from the early 1990s was choose us, we're closer than Switzerland. I mean, they were very open about what it is they were doing. But at any rate, this opened up the entire former space of the Soviet Union to these shady characters that were selling off the country's natural wealth, pocketing the cash, and then using offshore banks in places like Riga to then redirect that money to places like London and New York for safekeeping. Now, where it has relevance for the, say, post 2008 period is that these Chekist figures, the Silvecki, who we are always hearing about, the KGB, the people who've really helped to create these new rich guys, begin to get resentful of the fact that they were left out of the deal. And so Putin begins to bring them back into the deal, and they begin targeting, well, even before 2008, when we had Khodorkovsky being arrested and putting into jail, they begin to make their move against these 1990s oligarchs, and they begin to replace them.
Yes, and in fact, just to finish up that point, can you explain, just because people probably do encounter this from time to time, can you explain the scheme whereby major state industries were sold off through so-called shares? Can you explain
Yeah,
how that worked? Because that was one of the main mechanisms that created the oligarchs that we talk about now, who have, of course, as you just mentioned, subsequently either fallen in line with Putin or, as in the case of Khodorkovsky, fled.
right. Yeah, so this is the infamous loans for shares scheme. The infamous loans for shares scheme. So how it was decided, now this is post Gorbachev, how it was decided during the early part of the Yeltsin rule to redesign the Soviet economy was to put these massive state enterprises in the hands of a new ruling economic elite. And so what they did was they held auctions. I mean, this is how privatizations are supposed to work in terms of textbook, explanations of how they're supposed to work. You're supposed to have an auction. You're supposed to get the best price that you can for the asset, and then you become the owner of that asset. Well, there's no reason that the state could not have just kept these assets, and it did with a few, such as Gazprom. But the process was entirely rigged. I mean, all you had to do in the context of an environment that was in the early 1990s, capital starved, is to provide now I'm referring to the banks. You had to just direct loans to the figures that you wanted to be able to, often figures connected to yourself, to buy those assets for pennies on the dollar, and give them just enough money to do that. So it was an entirely corrupt process that transferred this vast store of national wealth over to just a few people in this loans for shares scheme. So um, uh, you combine that with the destruction of the Soviet ruble, again designed to wipe out the savings of everyone. And then, of course, you also had privatization vouchers. I mean, rather, these vouchers that were supposed to be able enable everyday citizens to be able to invest in the economy. Well, I mean, come on, what are you going to do with these things? So if you're an average person and you have some of these vouchers, you just sell them for a bottle of vodka or whatever to somebody who then scoops them all up, and then they are used to help purchase major assets as well. So it was just a corrupt transfer of the entire national public wealth represented by state enterprises to a handful of oligarchs.
And just to finish up that point before we return to this issue of Gorbachev and the final years of his tenure and the final years of the Soviet Union, I want to mention also the role that well, how do I want to say this? The ways in which the transfer of wealth from what had been the Soviet state into the hands of this new class, the ways in which that then creates the modern Russia that we have today, because that is an important point. It's not just that people got rich, it's that an entire political and economic and even social structure is erected on top of all of these corrupt dealings and practices that were going on in a relatively short period of time. So I guess, can you finish up the point by just helping us to understand how the current system in Russia that we see today is really built on this foundation?
Oh yeah, it's as you've said, it's an oligarchic model, and it's one in which uh, these state enterprises that became public property uh, became the true centers of power in the country. And then, of course, over time, Putin uh, takes this system, um, and he does not dismantle it. I mean, he makes it, I guess, more stable to a certain extent. So, in other words, the privatizations of the 1990s were kind of wild. And there were lots of still competing figures that were taking each other out in the literal sense of the term. And he more or less institutionalizes it, and brings the more independent minded members of the oligarchy to heel, uh, and restores the power of the state security services, and really makes them uh, a class of people that share in this great wealth. To refer to a great old book that was published in 1967 by the late great economist John Kenneth Galbraith, the New Industrial State, he referenced this term which he called the technocracy. The technocracy, and what Galbraith, for some of your younger viewers, I mean, Galbraith was this giant in the field of economics in the middle of the 20th century. He was at Harvard all the way up until the end. I think, he was about 101 or something when he passed. Uh, Originally a Canadian farmer, and always did economics from the perspective of what he thought was the public interest. But at any rate, quite unlike perhaps what you might see today. He he asserted that the that society is comprised of this class of managers. They're the ones who are really running things, and that you could not let, if you wanted social cohesion and stability, you could not let certain sectors of the technocracy be marginalized or pushed to the side. So, in other words, if you're going to have a class of oligarchs, you could not have other members of the managerial class all living like paupers. They just wouldn't. They just wouldn't tolerate it. So, in a sense, what Putin does is he starts bringing other select sectors of that managerial class into this scheme to share in the wealth that Russia still produces. And I'm referring, of course, to the security services. So,
Yes, exactly.
they're going to be made rich, many of them.
Yeah, I mean that's the point I was just going to say, is that in a sense Putin is the bridge. He's the
Oh
bridge
yeah,
between the intelligence services, the KGB apparatchiks, that whole state security class, and the oligarch class, and he basically is in a sense kind of the bridge between those two worlds. And in just as you mentioned, you know, the idea of his bringing stability, which is actually what the most of the myth of Putin is based on, the idea that he kind of stabilized this wild west of the 1990s and sort of returned Russia to a kind of safe, whatever, political and economic space. That is built on this idea of sort of marrying these contradictory forces into what they now call the sistema, right? Which is the Russian system, whereby Putin stands at the center, juggling all these competing forces and represents kind of, I don't know, the brain of it or whatever.
right. And of course, that was quite welcomed at first by many people, of course, given the trauma of the 1990s. But what Putin either never could figure out or did not want to figure out because of the implications of that was to how to create some greater degree of dynamism. The same challenge that Gorbachev and Andropov observed: how to create some greater. I mean, he wanted it both ways. He wanted to preserve this system that he created of institutionalized corruption, and at the same time, he wanted to introduce some degree of dynamism in the economy, understanding that without that, I mean, ultimately you perish. And that's something that the last decade has revealed, is that he just was unable to resolve or to square that set of contradictions.
He was also
So it was a kind of we can refer to this, I think, as the Putin neoliberal model, right? I mean, so, and we see that in terms of the central bank and how they were always advocates of more kind of neoliberal policies, which Putin, I think, was more or less inclined to support and did, but none of this generated the unleashing of economic potential, which they thought that maybe it could. We saw this idea that Russia was going to create its own MIT, and there was actually even a formal relationship between them, and that didn't. I mean, there were all of these efforts that just did not pay off, in part because of insufficient investment, but other factors as well. If I could just return to just one quick point though before I know our time is short. Uh, I, 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 I kind of argue in the article that by the time Gorbachev finds himself at the helm of the Soviet Union, that it would have been damn near impossible to reform it. And so we can't lay the blame at his feet. Now, I would argue that if you did want that, 1 in a million lottery chance of actually reforming it, that he undertook the wrong set of policies to achieve that end result, and in the wrong order. But nonetheless, it was already too far gone, and it just did not have the same set of advantages that China had. So there's often, this tendency to compare China with the Soviet Union, and these are just completely apples and oranges. They cannot be compared. While Deng Xiaoping certainly disagreed with Gorbachev, especially with regards to Glasnost, uh, as the way to reform this other Stalinist, Maoist economy in China. They just had an entirely different set of conditions. One, the United States was blowing wind into their sails. They wanted China as a hedge against the still existing Soviet Union. The United States was using China in its massive rural reserve army of cheap labor to keep profit levels up in the United States and to keep wages down in the United States by exporting or subcontracting out production to China. Uh, so it was just an entirely different situation. I mean, the Soviet Union had in the 1980s wages compared to China that were really high, actually, and it was already a nearly fully urbanized society. So there was no great reserve army of cheap labor to draw upon, and you just could not do what China successfully did in the way that they did it.
Cut. Jeff, can you hold on 1 second? I have somebody at the door. I'll be right
You
back.
bet. Hey, Eric, we probably only have a couple of minutes left, or
Yep.
what?
Yep. Just a couple of
Should
minutes.
do we want to talk about the war at all?
Yeah. Well, the current war or World War II? Yeah. Okay.
Not this one,
Okay. Yeah. Well, we
unfortunately.
can we can we can we can get into that. Actually, I'm gonna
Okay.
get there in 1 second. Are you on a time crunch?
No, not terribly, but
Okay.
I know that these things, if you make them more than an hour, then people
Yeah.
their attention span goes away.
Absolutely. Three, two, one. All right. I want to shift gears a little bit in the time that we have remaining, Jeff, and just first of all, I want to shift back to Gorbachev and to understanding. Well, you just made an interesting point in your previous comment that I 100% agree with, that in some senses Gorbachev really gets treated unfairly by history because of the nature of when he rises to his position, the, as you already say, sort of the entrenched inefficiencies and breakdowns, and all of the corruption and all of the things that were already present there. And on top of that, he's also saddled with a disastrous war in Afghanistan that he did not launch himself, and also of course, the rising class of people that we were just talking about. So I want to have a retrospective look at Gorbachev, keeping in mind all of these forces that were so much bigger than him. And it's not that I'm soft on Gorbachev, although I guess maybe I am as compared to the people who demonize him endlessly, right? But I do think that this was so much bigger than him, and he was, in some senses, maybe not powerless, but almost powerless against these forces.
Yeah, it was way bigger than him. I mean, if he had a fault, it might be that it might be vanity a little bit. Uh, and I think you're right. We do judge him too harshly. I think probably the last possible chance of reforming the Soviet Union would have been when Andropov took power. And if he would have been able to last, maybe even then it was too late. But that was really the last chance. But just as you say, so you have this crisis in Afghanistan, which as we know, is in part engineered by the United States. Jimmy Carter's national security advisor is a Zbigniew Brzezinski, Polish nationalist, and he says flat out in an interview in 1998 in La Figaro that he wanted to give the Soviets their own Vietnam. He wanted to take them down a peg there. And of course, Gorbachev was not interested in continuing to fight this war. He had to figure out a way to extricate himself from it. And then, of course, the United States as well had other cards to play. One was its alliance with the Saudis. And so it gets the Saudis to open up the oil spigot and take the price of oil way down, at one point all the way down to $10 a barrel. So the United States was able to impose some hardships on the Soviet Union. But fair enough. I mean, that's what the Soviets would do with the United States when they could as well. I mean, that's what the Cold War was about, unfortunately. But yeah, so immense challenges, and yes, Gorbachev did not use the limited bargaining power that he had with the West early enough. I mean, could he have gotten much more aid from them if he would have let the Warsaw Pact dissolve earlier? Sure, but what would he have done with that aid? What would have happened to it by the time he finally did get some aid for pulling out of the German Democratic Republic? That money just seems to have disappeared, and and then at the very end of the Soviet Union, they just couldn't even feed themselves. I mean, so it was a disaster. And again, I agreeing with you, I just don't know if he could have turned it around.
Yeah, and on top of that, one of the interesting things about Gorbachev, and you make this point in the article several times, is that he was a true believer.
Oh yeah,
He
yeah,
believed in communism and socialism. He
right.
believed in Lenin and Lenin's ideas. He believed in these things, and in a sense, that almost made him out of step with his own generation of leaders, because many of the people who had risen to high positions, especially people like Putin, are notoriously anti-ideological and are not interested in all of the academics of socialism and
Oh yeah,
Marxism
right.
and
As
all
we
of that
know, I
other
mean,
stuff,
right. I mean,
So
Putin hates the Bolsheviks, right?
yeah,
And Brezhnev, was once asked to, in one of his speeches, quote some Lenin, and he just purportedly kind of haughtily turned to one of his aides and said, "Come on, nobody believes I read this stuff." uh, so, and the KGB was, the Soviet Union did kind of create an upper middle class, mostly Czechs. Now, Putin, of course, is not one of those guys. He comes out of the school of hard knocks and in St. Petersburg, but a lot of the Czechs were really erudite, elites that they didn't hold any regard or love for this idea of a workers' revolution. And they thought that the Soviet leadership was there through an ideological affirmative action, that they were all idiots, and that they should be replaced with someone, meaning me, them. you know, they thought they should be running the show.
So Gorbachev in the last little bit of his life, of course, was in an awkward position because while he undoubtedly had personal views on everything that was going on in Russia, he didn't express them openly for the most part, with maybe a few exceptions. And so thinking about the fact that Gorbachev dies here in 2022, the year that Putin launches this historically disastrous war on Ukraine, I'm wondering, what do we think Gorbachev might have thought about all of this? And how do you think Gorbachev would have looked upon all of this happening? Because as you say, he was raised by Ukrainian grandparents. He grew up in an area of Russia that is almost Ukraine. I mean, you know what I mean? To the point where your neighbors and your friends and everybody probably have friends and neighbors and relatives and so forth in Ukraine. So very connected to it. And so I guess my question is, on the one hand, what do you think he thought of this? But on the other hand, what does it tell us about where Russia has come to, the place that it has come to after all of these decades?
Well, first, of course, the war is just as you say; it is a disaster. We don't know how it'll play out yet. On one level, it doesn't matter. I mean, what has already happened has been such an immense human tragedy, and every day that it continues, it delivers more of the same in terms of misery. It's a complicated question. On one level, Gorbachev was of the view that Crimea was Russian. He thought the Donbass was Russian, and at the same time, I think he would not have countenanced an invasion like this at all. And the question is such a messy one regarding Ukraine, and I'll make no friends talking about it, of course. But when the Soviet Union was dissolving, it wasn't done in an entirely orderly fashion, and these things never are. I mean, what's remarkable about it was just how little bloodshed there was with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But there were some negotiations that were occurring between the now Russian Republic and the Soviet Ukrainian Republic, as especially as Yeltsin had asserted his power over who gets what. And the Russian leadership was, mostly of the view that, oh, come on, guys, don't be serious, you know, don't think you're going to have the Donbass and Ukraine here, and of course, and rather Crimea. And the Ukrainians were of the view that no, these were areas that were historically populated by Ukrainian speakers, at least, with maybe the exception of Crimea. But even in the Donbass, I mean, of course, as it industrializes with French capital in the late 19th century, then all of a sudden, of course, you have all these ethnic Russian speakers that move into the area. But the rural areas, still Ukrainian speaking. But of course, then we have this Vichy-like Ukrainian regime, which is created by the Germans after World War One, and of course that includes Crimea and the Donbass, and it's even a little bit bigger in terms of territories to the east. So it's not surprising that the Ukrainians want that. But if I could make just one other point, there's also the issue of populism here, and it's terrible how the term is always used pejoratively. I'm going to do that myself here right now. As the Soviet Union was falling apart and as Gorbachev was making his last gasp attempts at keeping it together as kind of an economic union, what Yeltsin was able to do was to go to the Ukraine and say, hey, you want your freedom and your liberty, and the same thing in Russia. How was he able to do that? He went to workers. And the argument that both Ukrainian and Russian nationalists made with their working class was to say in Ukraine, hey, imagine how rich we would be if we just got rid of these Russians. We've got this industrial area in the Donbass, and we've got this black earth belt that is agriculturally the most productive in the world. Imagine if we could just untether ourselves from this Soviet Union thing. We'll be massively rich. And then the Russians, of course. And Yeltsin really believed this stuff. Imagine how rich we're going to be once we cut ourselves off from all these other republics who we're supporting out of our budget. We have, with all of them, with the exception of one in Central Asia, a massive, imbalance in which we're sending them way more money than we're getting back from them. So there was a simple idea that you just untether and then you're fine. But I think getting back to your important question, Gorbachev would have been horrified by this war. At the same time, he as the 21st century unfolded, he was also very unhappy with the United States and how he thought that the United States increasingly took advantage of Russia.
Well, and that's where Gorbachev's naivete is unforgivable, right? The part of Gorbachev, or at least for me, that's truly unforgivable, I think, is in his lack of recognition of the nature of Western imperialism. I don't think he fully grasped what the United States was as an imperial entity. He understood the United States in a Cold War
Hmm.
context. He understood them as a rival superpower, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think he understood what imperialism would be and would become as its rival unraveled. And I
Well,
think
this
that
is where you're absolutely right. This is where his vanity got in the way, because they flattered him endlessly, the Americans and the Germans, and he actually had an interesting example. I mean, I'm appalled by everything Ronald Reagan represented, but the one damn thing that Reagan did right was to ignore his national intelligence and defense establishment and proceed with these negotiations with Gorbachev. They were all thoroughly against it. People like the Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger, was storming around, having fits, threatening to resign. They were all saying that, look, the Soviets are just trying to lull you into this false sense of security. They're going to get you to denuclearize, and then they're going to attack you. Uh, I think I think from the perspective of the time, Gorbachev was taken in by what he thought was the possibility of agency actually existing. Here is this US president that is actually operating against his entire national defense and intelligence apparatus and taking the country in a direction that, in principle, it should not be able to be taken. If you just had a purely kind of structuralist view of the way countries operate. So yeah, but yeah, you're right. I mean, you're right. I mean, he got blinded by the flattery, and when he had nothing left to bargain with in terms of chips, uh, yeah, then it was like, oh, Gorby, wonderful guy. Boy, wish we could help you out, but we can't. you know.
well, and that ultimately, I think, is part of the complex legacy that he leaves behind, right? Because on the one hand, it's like, he made good faith efforts, right? He really made good faith attempts to reform the system within the Soviet Union, to basically try to end the Cold War, or at the very least sort of wind it down from what it had been, whether it's nuclear treaties or anti-ballistic missile treaties or whatever. I mean, these things were extremely important, and Gorbachev does get credit for those things. And at the same time, it's very interesting that he just seems to have not understood imperialism in this sense, that imperialism is a system and that it doesn't care what you do or what deal you make with the person who may or may not be at the head at a given moment, that imperialism rolls on. And so I guess, to me, that's where this whole argument about, well, Putin launched the war because NATO expanded eastward, is totally ludicrous, right? The idea that NATO expanded eastward, yeah, that's what empires do. They are imperialist, and that's how they operate. So again, coming back to Ukraine now, Putin doesn't get to justify a genocidal war of this kind, that where he seeks to erase Ukraine, which, by the way, he launched this war with a stridently anti-Lenin, anti-communist,
Oh,
anti-Bolshevik
I,
speech,
I remember well. Yeah,
the most anti-communist speech I think I've ever heard.
right.
And in a sense, it's predicated on this idea that, well, NATO's expansion forced us into this. But yet, if you look at the actual history of 30 years, of the last 30 years, maybe you could say some naivete on the part of the Soviets. But beyond that, imperialism's doing what imperialism does.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, we know it's. I mean, there's that imperialism, and of course, there's the desire of all of these newly independent countries on the border of Russia to have security. So, I mean, that stuff can't be just entirely dismissed. I mean, there are too many people that I know that had their relatives, sent off in uh, cattle cars in the middle of the winter to Siberia, just dropped off and told, go fend for yourself. So people remember that kind of stuff, and so not that this justifies NATO expansion in the way that it has expanded, and in what NATO is, because it's essentially the arm of the United States. We'll know that, but yeah, nonetheless, these are real issues. They're complex, and they need to be understood. And I would agree with you. Again, knowing that Russia was just endlessly antagonized by the Americans, and but nonetheless, that does not justify this war.
Well, Jeff, I was so engaged by our conversation that I forgot to take a break in the middle of it. So I guess people are going to listen to unadulterated 70 minutes of us talking. But final question, Jeff, for you.
A stock of a night shock work.
So, final question, Jeff. What tell us about Gorbachev's legacy as you see it? We already talked about that a little bit, but as both a political economist, but something of a historian yourself, how do we write the hagiography, of Gorbachev? How do we tell the story of Gorbachev and capture some of the nuances of the historical moment in which he was prominent?
Yeah, another great question. That he was, as you say, a well-intentioned leader. That he was thoughtful. He was smart. He was engaged. Because of his vanity, he had significant blind spots, and he presided over a system that unraveled at the ultimate cost of millions prematurely dying, millions being consigned to horrific levels of poverty, all unintended on his part, and much of which would have been at best difficult uh, to have. Uh, to have changed, given his departure and a replacement by the figure of Boris Yeltsin and the interests of this new corrupt Russian elite and of international capital that worked together to essentially pillage Russia.
So, Jeff, the article talks about how he became the most hated man or the most reviled man in Russia. And in thinking about that, he was kind of hated by everybody, wasn't he? Because he was hated by those who have crowded around Putin, who see Gorbachev as this weak, leader who allowed for all of this to happen and victimized by the West. He's also simultaneously hated by those with this extreme Soviet nostalgia for whom he represents the sort of polar opposite of that. And so, in a sense, he kind of is in no man's land historically, right? He's hated on both sides, as it were.
Yeah, yeah, and this is, sometimes I find this even in just personal interactions. I mean, sometimes, uh, you know, trying to make as many people happy as possible will, of course, earn you the most enemies. That's for sure. And sometimes it's not the way to go. Is to just try and make everyone happy. I think it's a good uh, inclination to have, but you can't always try and act on that. But in terms of his legacy, as I say at the end of my piece, all he was left with was a foundation, one which had marginal influence by the 1990s and by the 21st century was almost entirely neglected.
Indeed. Okay, we'll leave it there. Jeff Sommers has been with me again. The article we've been talking about, it's really a great piece that we had on Counterpunch a couple of weeks ago. How Mikhail Gorbachev became the most reviled man in Russia. Again, Jeffrey Sommers. The book, I want you to all to get a copy of The Contradictions of Austerity, the Socioeconomic Costs of the Neoliberal Baltic Model. He's a professor of political economy and public policy in the Department of African and Diaspora Studies and senior fellow at the Institute of World Affairs, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Jeff is a regular counterpuncher, and we always love to talk to him. Hey, Jeff, thanks again for chatting with us.
Great being with you, Eric. Keep up the counterpunching.
Listeners, excuse me, listeners, viewers, thank you as always, and we will chat again next time.